What's up, guys? Asian here again with a not PTS. This is actually the live version of Wrathstone. So Wrathstone is now live on PC, NA, and PC EU consoles. You guys will have to wait 2 more weeks before you guys will get the Wrathstone patch iteration. So consider your PC friends to be your bug testers for the next 2 weeks or so, while we figure out what they broke and what they didn't break in Wrathstone. So this is patch 4.3.5. The full patch notes will be linked down in the description below for those of you guys who want to peruse all of the various notes in here. We will just be going over kind of the most pertinent changes to PvE balance. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about PvP, but this will mostly be focused in on how these changes are going to be affecting PvE for healers, tanks, DPS in a vet trials scenario. So 4.3.5 is Wrathstone. So this is a dungeon DLC. So there's going to be 2 new dungeons, Frostvault and Depths of Malatar. Each of those have 3 sets, light, medium, and heavy, as well as a new monster helm set. In addition, they also focused on updating the racial passives. They updated a few sets, and they made a couple of changes here and there to other gameplay things, such as mundus stones. Older sets were updated that might shift the balance a little bit when it comes to DPS, healing, and tanking for PvE. Now, one thing to note, if you guys have not yet logged in yet, is that they are doing some sort of code-related things to the database, so load times might take a little bit longer than they are used to. This is just going to be the first load screen when you first load in. So if you do have a raid at, for example, 7 p.m., you might want to try to log in at around 6:30 p.m. just to make sure, in case you do happen to get stuck on a longer load screen, you do have time to get out of that load screen there. So again, we're just going to be going through all of the changes that are going to be affecting PvE and whether or not they also affect PvP. So 2 new dungeons, Frostvault and Depths of Malatar. So these are DLC dungeons, so these are going to be obviously more difficult than your base game dungeons. I have only done Frostvault on Vet Hard Mode. And this was before they nerfed quite a bit of things on the last boss here. But generally speaking, from what I could tell, these 2 dungeons are pretty much on par with the previous dungeon DLC sets, DLCs that were released. So like Dragon Bones, Horns of the Reach, Wolf Hunter. So very difficult dungeons. So if you can get through, March of Sacrifices or Moonhunter Keep hard mode, then you stand a good chance of completing Frostvault and Depths of Malatar on hard mode as well. So there are new item sets from each of the 2 dungeons. So again, there's 4 new sets from each dungeon. There's a light, medium, and heavy set, and then a monster helm set. Starting off with Frostvault, you have Icy Conjurer. That's the light armor set. It gives you Magicka, spell damage, spell pen, and the 5-piece. Applying a minor debuff on your enemy summons a non-reflectable ice wraith that will charge into your enemy, dealing 18,920 frost damage over 8 seconds. This effect can occur once every 12 seconds. So this is probably going to end up being more for PvP, less so for PvE because of that minor debuff application procs condition. So you probably won't see this being used all too much for PvE. Even on like an Ice Mage build on a Warden, Wardens don't really have minor debuffs unless you're using something like poisons for whatever reason. So even then, that's probably not going to be quite as useful in PvE. Sogman's Warband is a medium armor set, 2 weapon crits and a spell penetration. With a 5-piece, when you deal crit damage, you gain a stack of precision, increasing weapon crit by 129 for 10 seconds. This stacks up to 10 times. At max stacks, you also gain minor force, increasing your critical damage done by 10%. Now, this is obviously not quite as strong as Vantiokeda. You get lower crit chance. I believe this is just shy of 5%. Crit chance, actually just a little bit over 5% additional crit chance. Even though you do gain that minor force, so that does save you 1 global cooldown. Advanced Yokeda gives you just shy of twice as much crit chance, so Advanced Yokeda is still going to be stronger. That being said, Sogman's is going to be a viable option for bow builds. It might actually end up being the best gear choice for your front bar set for bow builds, for those of you guys who play bow builds. Mighty Glacier is the heavy set. It adds Stamina, Magicka, Stam regen, Magicka regen, and then the 5-piece when you cast a Snare or Immobilize ability, or hit a target with a Snare or Immobilize ability, you and up to 11 group members gain Major Resolve, Major Ward for 15 seconds. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. So this is basically more or less the Warden's Expansive Frost Cloak, just in a set form. So if you have a Warden off tank or Warden healer, this set is pretty much going to be redundant and not all that useful. In addition, that proc condition, the Snare or Mobilize ability, you're not really going to be using those all too often. The only one I can think of that you'll be using very often as a tank would be Heroic Slash. So Heroic Slash does have a minor snare to it, so that's not a 100% snare, so it should proc Mighty Glacier, but again, if you have a Warden off tank or a Warden healer, they will typically already be running expansive Frost Cloak, so pretty redundant to use there. Now the monster helm set is Stonekeeper. It has stamina, magicka, and health, just a little bit of each, so basically a mini triglyph there, or I should say a slightly stronger version of a triglyph. When you block an attack, you gain an energy charge stack up to 1 stack per second. When you gain 6 charges, you release the energy, restoring 5350 stamina and magicka and healing for 5350 health. After releasing the charges, you cannot regain new charges for 14 seconds, so this effectively gives you a 20-second cooldown on this 5350 stamina and magicka regen. If you decide to go ahead and math it out, that ends up being 535 effective magicka, stamina, and health regen per second if you're able to proc it every 20 seconds, basically on cooldown. So this should be a fairly good set for a selfish setup for a tank. 535 additional regen is not something to laugh at. It is definitely going to be a set that I think would be fairly useful to have on hand for any sort of conditions fights where you might want to play a little bit more selfishly as a tank. It is kind of dependent on being able to block attacks, and you only gain 1 per second, and it is on a 20-second cooldown, so that's just something that you do want to keep in mind there. Depths of Malatar also has 4 sets. The light armor set is Auroran's Thunder, health, spell damage, and spell pen. When you damage a nearby enemy with a single target ability, you summon a cone of lightning from your chest for 3 seconds, dealing 1285 shock damage every half a second to enemies in the cone. This effect can occur every 6 seconds, so very similar to proc sets. You probably won't be seeing this used all too much in PvE. The overall DPS you would get from this would be 1285 before any sort of damage done, damage received buff, so not terribly powerful. You might see this being used a little bit, but that max health enchant kind of kills it for PvE. And for PvE or PvP, there's probably stronger proc sets out there. Scavenging Demise is the medium armor set. It adds weapon damage and 2 weapon crits. When you deal critical poison damage to an enemy, summon the Scavenging Maw, who, after 2 seconds, attacks the enemy, deals 7,000 poison damage, and inflicts minor vulnerability for 15 seconds. This effect can occur every 10 seconds. So this is actually a fairly interesting set to use. Because that critical poison damage, for PvE at the very least, you always have poison injection up, and that counts as poison damage. So if you get a critical hit on a dot there, then you do have a chance of summoning this Scavenging Maw as long as you're off that cooldown. Stam decays pretty much all your dots are poison damage, so you have an increased chance of proccing this. So this might be used on Stam DPS for that minor vulnerability that would free up 1 slot armor set for healers. Generally speaking, I think Infallible Aether will still end up being used for healers rather than Scavenging Demise, but again, it's kind of up in the air how that's going to work out, mainly because the DPS that you would get from Scavenging Demise, just from the base, would only be 700 additional DPS, which is actually not that powerful. But so it is an interesting set, but I don't think it's going to be used too much in PvE. Frozen Watchers, the heavy armor set. It adds stamina, health, and stamina. Summon a blizzard around you while blocking, inflicting 1000 frost damage every second to enemies within your blizzard. The blizzard has 15% chance of inflicting chills on enemies damaged. So this is actually something that I think would be a nice set to pick up for tanks. More so for Warden tanks, less so for other classes, mainly because of that kind of AoE chilled effect. I do have to kind of say how large the blizzard is, but it could end up being a useful replacement for Thervicon. So instead of running Thervicon as your monster helm set for that AoE minor maim, you could just run Frozen Watcher instead. It won't be a guaranteed minor maim, but if you're a Warden tank running this, then you do get that additional bonus from your ice skill tree passive. So I think it bumps it up to 45% chance, so pretty good chance of inflicting chill as long as you're blocking. So I think this might be interesting on a Warden off tank, but I don't think it'll see much use outside of very niche scenarios. Now the monster helm is Symphony of Blades. It adds 2% healing done, and when you heal an ally whose primary resource is under 50%, grant them Meridia's favor, restoring 2325 of that resource every 1 second for 6 seconds on an 18-second cooldown. Now, this set is a cooldown on the proc itself. So once you proc it, it has an 18-second cooldown. It is not per ally. So you can only proc this once every 18 seconds. Plus, you cannot proc it on yourself. So while it might seem powerful, it is actually fairly limited. So I don't really see this being used all too much for healers. So that 18-second cooldown is what kills it, and the fact that it only procs once on every 18 seconds. Those are the new sets that were introduced. In the base game, they did add in a zone guide, so that way you're able to see what you're missing from a zone. They also updated the guild trader base game interaction, so it's going to be more similar to Awesome Guild Store for those of you guys who use that add-on. They added in a new battleground map. They added in some new outfits, styles, and PvP collectibles. They added a lot of collectibles. Then they updated a bunch of Cyrodiil sets. So they updated some of the older Cyrodiil sets to be a little bit more useful. So Deadly Strike is now weapon damage, weapon crit, weapon damage, and increases the damage your physical, bleed, poison, and disease damage over time abilities do by 14%. This set actually is very interesting to use. It is very situational. It's going to really be dependent on your class, but Stam DKs and Stamplars for PvE might make good use of Deadly Strike. They also changed Deadly Strike so it is a medium armor set and not a heavy armor set now. Old Deadly Strike sets, so if you have pieces from prior to this patch, they will still be, if you're jewelry and healthy. So only the new sets will be medium armor or robust for jewelry. Buffer of the Swift is now max Magicka, spell resistance, and physical resistance, and reduces the damage you take from players by 10%. Alessian Order is now physical spell resistance and max health, and increases your health regen by 1% for your sum total physical and spell resistance. So, for example, if you have 60,000 combined physical and spell resistance, then this 5-piece would give you 1% of that, which would give you 600 effective health regen. This might be interesting for tanks, health regen tanks. I don't really know anybody who plays that anymore, but for those of you guys who might want to do a health regen tank, this is definitely a set that you might want to consider picking up. Beckoning Steel adds spell resistance, max health, physical resistance, and generate an aura that causes you and 11 group members within the area to take 10% less damage from projectiles. You can only be affected by one set of Beckoning Steel at one time. This might be interesting in certain PvE fights where you might be taking a lot of damage from projectiles, potentially maybe, for example, Cloud Rest hard mode because of all the, I think the orb projectiles when you kill the orbs might count. So this might be interesting, but I don't really see this being used too much in PvE. Curse Eater is now Magicka, max Magicka, Magicka regen. When you heal yourself or an ally with a direct heal ability, remove up to 3 negative effects from them. If the negative effect was removed this way, your target restores 600 Magicka. This effect can occur every 8 seconds. So basically, a direct heal ability is anything that does a heal right away. So it is not something like mutagen or rapid regen, where it's a heal over time. It has to be a direct heal. So something like Breath of Life, Hasty Prayer, those would count as direct heal abilities. The 8-second cooldown does limit it a little bit here, but it is basically more or less a free purge every 8 seconds. So very nice to have. Again, it only affects one person at a time every 8 seconds. So purge is still going to be more useful, especially in PvE scenarios. But this is a set that you might want to consider picking up. I think it'll be more useful in PvP compared to PvE. Sentry is now stamina, weapon damage, weapon crit. When you begin to crouch, you gain stealth detection for 10 seconds. This effect can occur every 30 seconds, and you gain weapon damage as well on that 5-piece. So those are the new sets there. The other one that's really interesting for PvE would be Deadly Strike for Stam DKs and Stamina Templars, because this does affect biting jabs and obviously all of your Stam DK dots. Moving on here, they made a couple of adjustments to Clockwork City. So now, Felms will always teleport 3 times rather than 2. You used to be able to get him to do 2 teleports if you were correctly positioned yourself, but now he will always teleport 3 times. So for those of you guys who are progressing through Asylum hard mode, just bear that in mind. He will always jump 3 times. You will not be able to do the 2-jump strategy anymore. For Dragon Bones, they did a couple of things with the dungeons, not too much here. Dungeons for Horns of the Reach, again, they adjusted a few things in Falkreath. Imperial City, they adjusted the ICP stuff here. Morrowind for Halls of Fabrication. There is actually a bug currently in Halls of Fabrication where the Dwemer spheres that spawn during the 100 killer fight, that's the first fight in Behalf, they continue to spawn even after you kill the boss. So that is an issue that is currently in the process of being resolved. So just bear in mind that if you want to do Halls of Fabrication on that, you pretty much will have to deal with the spheres throughout that entire fight from 100 killers all the way through the Pinnacle Factotums. So you might want to not run Halls of Fabrication until that bug is fixed there. For Murkmire, they fixed a couple of issues here and there. I think that's it for Murkmire. Not much here, just a lot of quest stuff. Orsinium, nothing much here. Somerset, couple of fixes here again. Thieves Guild, some more fixes here and there. They did fix the bug where the archers were enraging That doesn't happen anymore, so you'll be able to kill them faster now. Wolf Hunter, again, some adjustments for the dungeons. And now we're getting to the real meat of things, combat and gameplay. So they fixed quite a few issues here, but they also changed a couple of things. So let's go through each of them one at a time here. So they just fixed an issue where your ability bars could be desynced if you were bar swapping too often. Let's see. So successfully heavy attacking a target as blocking will now provide half the resources rather than none. This is going to be something that is more so for PvP, less for PvE, because PvE bosses don't typically block. All pets will now inherit all of your bonuses and derive stats, except for spell damage, obviously. Proc summon pets will still not be able to crit at all. So they will be able to inherit your crit hit chance, your crit hit multiplier, so that's your crit damage, any CP points you have, and then any other percentage damage or healing amps that can be applied to you. This is going to affect pet damage. The pet damage overall is going to be buffed up. They still do not inherit spell damage. Let me repeat that again, because a lot of people seem to have this misconception. They do not inherit spell damage at all. They are still affected only by max Magicka when it comes to how much damage they're doing. And again, proc sets still do not crit at all. So they'll just basically the main change here is that they'll inherit your TB points, your crit modifiers, things like that. So pets are going to be a little bit stronger now. Enchants on one-handed weapons will be half the potency of those placed on two-handed weapons. This applies to the damage and effectiveness, but not the cooldown. So an enchant that has a 4-second cooldown will still have a 4-second cooldown on a one-handed weapon. So this is a big change, a big hit to stamina DPS, because now you don't have 2 enchants anymore. You have 2 half enchants, which don't make up one whole enchant, unfortunately. So this is going to be a nerf to stamina DPS there, but generally speaking, stamina DPS is still around the same place where they were, just due to some other changes down the line here. This is a much bigger hit to tanks because you have a sword and board. So this does affect the enchant strength on your one hand and shield bar. So now if you want to have a full strength crusher, you basically need to run a staff back bar and have crusher proc on the staff back bar or bow back bar if you are kind of off DPS tanking. So that is definitely a big hit for tanks. Now double sword and board will always have half as much crusher effectiveness. So that's definitely going to be a hit. Tanks, you will need to learn how to tank with a staff back bar now if you haven't done so already. So proc sets cannot proc. Well, let's see here. Well, they changed a couple of proc conditions now. So the CP, passive, resilient, and critical leech are considered procs, which means they can't proc other proc abilities like item sets. So they just basically changed a couple of things about how proc sets work. The heal is no longer considered proc from siphoning strikes and its morphs here. They fixed a few issues here and there, but nothing too much here. The buffs and debuffs, they were fixing a couple of things here. So major and minor evasion, which reduce your AoE damage, they were affecting skills that they were not supposed to affect. So force pulse, overwhelming surge, radial uppercut, Selene, sheer venom, shrouded daggers, bounce damage, trap beast, unfathomable darkness, they will no longer be reduced by major and minor evasion. Abilities that proc major buffs that are not associated with healing or damage can now be applied to a maximum of 12 targets. So this affects Frostcloak from the Warden skill line, Molten Weapons from the DK skill line, Rapid Maneuvers, and Warhorn. So both of Rapid and Warhorn used to affect 24, so now it's down to 12. Molten Weapons and Frostcloak initially affected 6, but now it affects 12. So that's something to keep in mind here. So overall, this is going to be very nice for Warden healers or Warden tanks that use Frostcloak there. Mundus stones, they did increase the Shadow Mundus, so it is now increases your critical damage by 13% from 9%. This does not affect critical healing though, so this only affects critical hits from damage effects. They fixed a few issues here. Most of these fixes for healing abilities were kind of looking at the priority system. So they basically want to prioritize, make sure they were prioritizing the players that needed the healing the most and not pets. So they are going to end up prioritizing those who have the least amount of health, relative speaking. Let's see, so they made a couple of more here, a couple of issues here and there. So Boundless Storm, the cost was reduced just to kind of bring it more in line with other sort of sources of major expedition. Implosion was changed. So this passive basically used to have a chance to add on additional damage whenever you dealt shock or physical damage on a Sork once your enemy was, I believe, below 15% health. So now this passive is now Amplitude, and this passive is basically a reverse execute. So it increases your damage done against targets by 1% for every 10% health they currently have, which means that if you're up against a full health opponent, you have 10% additional damage done. If you're up against an opponent with 35% health, you have only 3% additional damage done. So the minimum bonus that you can get from this is 1% damage done. So there's something that's new here. It kind of remains to be seen whether or not this really affects Sork DPS. But overall, it does seem like Sorks did get a buff, but that's more from pet changes, less so from this implosion change. Overload, it fixed a couple of issues with Overload, as well as Storm Atronach. For the Templar, they fixed a couple of issues here. So the big change is going to be Solar Barrage. They increased the damage dealt by 10%. Plus, it basically now grants infinite Empower bonus while you have it up. So rather than doing one Empower bonus after each tick, you basically have 8 seconds of Empower, permanent Empower, basically, for 8 seconds. So every light attack you do while Solar Barrage is up increases your light attack by 40%. So this is a very nice buff for those of you guys who play within melee range. Magicka in general will typically be using Solar Barrage now. I still have to see whether or not this majorly affects ranged Magicka builds, mainly because obviously you won't be in range for Solar Barrage, but the Empowered is still in effect, so it might still end up being a buff for ranged Magickas. Wardens just fixed a couple of issues. So for two-handed stuff, they did reduce the bleed applied from axes. So this is for both two-handed as well as dual wield. So they reduced the bleed damage from the axe by about 12%, and they also increased the damage of the swords. So two-handed swords will now get 6% increased damage done, and one-handed swords will get 3% damage done instead. So they just buffed swords, they nerfed axes, they left daggers, and maces / mauls completely unchanged here. They fixed a couple issues with bow abilities. Ancient Knowledge, which is under a passive under the Destruction Staff line, you no longer need to have a Destruction Staff ability slotted to gain the use of this passive. Now you just need to have the Destruction Staff equipped. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility when it comes to putting down abilities for Magicka DPS. You no longer need to worry about having Destro Staff abilities on each bar now. Fixed a couple of issues here with the morphs for Soul Magic, Vampire, Werewolf. Just fixed a few issues here and there. So the bleed from werewolves will no longer proc enchants. So only the light attacks themselves will proc those enchants now. So bleeds will not proc enchants anymore. Inner Fire and Trapping Webs, the range for the synergies is 12 meters now to activate rather than 18. So now you don't need to be quite as far to activate them. Still not very useful, the synergies, but hey, it's still something. Under the Psijic Order, the biggest change here is now they've increased the base cost of Time Stop to 8100. So this is before any sort of passive cost reduction or anything like that. So this was mainly to kind of combat how people were using Time Stop in Cyrodiil and PvP. This is definitely going to be a big nerf for Templar and Nightblade tanks in PvE though, because this was really your only source of a hard CC. So that really kind of sucks for those guys. But it will remain to be seen whether this will continue to remain at this cost or the duration of the patch. The big change here on the Alliance War skill tree is Rapid Maneuvers and Purge. So Purge will now benefit from the Magicka 8 passive, so you will get that 5 or 10% additional Magicka regen when you have Purge slotted. But Rapid Maneuvers will no longer provide immunity to snares and immobilize. So retreating maneuvers, rather than removing snares and immobilizations, will basically grant a bonus that reduces damage taken from behind by 15%. So will no longer be able to use rapid maneuvers to basically get rid of snares and immobilizations and continue to be immune to them. So big change here, I think, for PvP. Now the racials. This is the biggest changes here. So they basically updated pretty much all of the racials here. Now this is going to be 10 full racials that I'm going to have to go through. So I'll just basically try to summarize them as quickly as I can and talk about them maybe after I go through all of them. Starting with the High Elves. So first of all, that first basically like racial passive, the kind of flavor passive, that hasn't been changed at all. So those are pretty much remaining exactly the same. So for High Elves, you get 645 Magicka or stamina based on the lowest maximum. So if you have 10,000 stamina and 30,000 magicka, it'll return stamina, never magicka. This effect can occur once every 6 seconds after you have to activate a class ability to use this. It also reduces the damage you take by 5% when you're channeling or casting an ability. You gain 2,000 max magicka, you gain 258 spell damage. Argonians, your potion passive increases your max magicka by 1,000 and you restore 4,000 health, magicka, and stamina whenever you drink a potion. You get 1,000 max health and 2310 disease resistance, and you are immune to disease status effect, and you increase your healing done by 6%. Wood Elves, you get 258 stamina recovery, you get 2,000 max stamina, and you gain immunity to poison status effect, and you get 2310 poison resistance. You increase your stealth detection radius by 3 meters, and after you dodge roll, you gain 10% movement speed for 6 seconds, and an additional 1,500 physical and spell penetration for 6 seconds as well. Bretons, you get 2,000 max magicka now, you gain 2310 spell resistance and 100 magicka regen. The spell resistance will be doubled if you are afflicted with burning, chilled, or concussed, and it reduces the magicka cost of your abilities by 7%. Dark Elves, you gain 1875 magicka and stamina, you get 2310 flame resistance, and you are immune to the burning status effect. You gain 258 weapon and spell damage. Imperials, you get 2,000 max health, 2,000 max stam, and whenever you deal direct damage, you restore 333 health, magicka, and stamina on a 5-second cooldown. It also reduces the cost of all your abilities by 3%. Khajiits, you get 100 health regen and 85 stamina and magicka regen. You get 825 magicka, health, and stamina, and you get your critical damage and healing is increased by 10%. It also reduces your detection radius and stealth by 3 meters. Nords, you get 1,500 max stamina, and whenever you take damage, you gain 5 ultimate, and this can occur every 10 seconds. You get 1,000 max health, and you gain immunity to the chill status effect and 2310 cold resistance, and you get 3960 physical and spell resistance. Orcs, you get 2,000 max stamina, you gain 1,000 max health, and you heal up to 600 when you deal damage with a weapon with a 4-second cooldown. You gain 258 weapon damage, it reduces the cost of your sprint by 12% and increases your movement speed while sprinting by 10%. And finally, Red Guards. You reduce the cost of your weapon abilities by 8% and reduces the effectiveness of snares applied to you by up to 15%. You get 2,000 max stamina, and whenever you deal damage with a melee attack, you restore 792 stamina. This effect can, you restore 950 stamina every time you deal direct damage. This effect can occur every 5 seconds. So a lot of changes to racials. Basically what it boils down to is that you no longer have percentage boost to your max stats. You no longer have elemental damage. It is now all flat bonuses. I will do a video kind of taking a look at ratios more in depth at a later time, but for right now that's just really very, very quick rundown of the new racial passives there. The champion point systems is now additive with other modifiers. So right now it is multiplicative, or I should say before Wrathstone it was a multiplicative, so it was 1.2 times your modifier. Now it is 1.2 plus whatever modifiers you have. So for example, if you have 30% additional max magicka, then with the CP passives you get 1.5 times as much max magicka now. So it is additive now. Then they fixed a couple of issues with sets. These are primarily, this particular issue is again prioritizing the most injured targets rather than just whatever targets possible. Anything minor vulnerability is now considered a debuff rather than a buff, so you can cleanse minor vulnerability now. Deadly Strike is now medium armor, we already mentioned that. A couple of issues here and there. Flanking Strategist will now give you 400 weapon damage against targets when you attack them from the side or the back. Let's see here. Plague Slinger fires 5 projectiles instead of 4 and a 1-second delay instead of a 1.5-second delay. Sentinel of Rukugams will no longer try to follow the target it's healing. It can no longer be targeted, and it will last a full duration and offer all of its healing and stamina returned now. So it'll last a full 8 seconds now rather than this countdown starting when it spawns. So it'll only start the countdown when it first starts to heal. Soldier of Anguish will no longer drop in bows and staves. Steadfast Hero, they fixed a couple of issues with certain purge abilities, proccing Steadfast Heroes. Virulent Shot, they fixed an issue with damage over time can be blocked and dodged. And then here they fixed a bunch of different things here. For PvP guys, leaderboard rewards will now grant jewelry items instead of all possible items for the 6 new sets that they introduced in the last last live patch, so that's Battalion Defender, Battlefield Acrobat, Indomitable Fury, Soldier of Anguish, Spell Strategist, and Steadfast Hero. They did change the matchmaking system in Battlegrounds, so you now with 3 main groups, you have a much better chance of facing other pre-made groups and things like that. So they did change a couple of things here. Now, one thing that has been reported is that oils and basically all siege weapons are now doing oblivion damage rather than straight up flame or whatever damage they used to deal. So just be mindful of that. Siege is now very, very overpowered in Cyrodiil. They are looking at it and trying to address that, hopefully with a hotfix, if not the next incremental patch here. And the rest of these is just basically not really anything that really affects PvE or anything like that. They did fix a couple of things with trials though, especially with Hell Ra. So top boss, also known as Yokeda Kai, their clones can no longer be attacked and they don't last quite as long. They're basically invulnerable now, but they must be interrupted. You still need to interrupt them when they do their flame spinny move now. The top boss and the bottom boss now have a linked wipe mechanic, so if either of you guys end up wiping, so top boss or bottom boss, basically you will wipe the other group as well. So if you happen to wipe on top boss, the bottom group will wipe as well. Bottom group, if you guys wipe, you will also wipe the top group there. So you can't use the switches until both bosses have been defeated. And other than that, that's pretty much it here. So they did change quite a few things here. The biggest thing is going to be those racial changes, as well as the introduction of a couple of new sets and the CP passive. So there have been quite a few changes in this patch overall. Generally speaking, for DPS, this Magicka DPS is up a little bit. So from what I've seen, you're looking at about a 2k or so buff overall to your DPS, Magicka DPS. Standard DPS, you guys are more or less where you guys have been in the past. It's a very, very small buff, but for all intents and purposes, you guys are pretty much where you were at last patch. So DPS of Magicka is a buff. Stamina DPS, pretty much more or less where you have been. Maybe a slight buff, but not that big of a buff. Nothing terribly noticeable there. Healers and tanks, the big thing here is that you just have new races that are considered best in slots. So healers, Bretons are now a lot stronger. For tanks, Nords are looking very, very nice for tanking as well. So that is pretty much it for this kind of overview of the patch notes. Again, link down in the description below to the full patch notes for you guys to peruse at your own leisure. If you guys have any questions or comments about anything that has been covered in this patch notes, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hopefully you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.